Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Boku no Pico of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka lathe cut 7-inch of live prescriptor rants.
Oh, I would shell out for that.
Die Hard edition available.
And I would because I am the black metal guy, aka Sanguine Spectre.
That's gotta be a band.
Or Spectral Sanguine. Or Spectral Ghost.
Are you just
or Spectral Spectre?
Are you just trying to make your own? That's our project. Spectral Spectre, our parody Instagram black metal project.
Yes, that's what I was thinking of. They've got like 3 words.
Fuck, do you have Go to War X's email?
This is Josh from Defeated Sanity, and you're listening to Terminus Extreme Metal Podcast.
And we are off with our first review of the night. This is the long-awaited return of War Metal Masters Diocletian with their new one, Inexorable Nexus, the 5th full-length record.
The Nexus cannot be X'd.
No. Yeah, it's a cool title. I like the Vortex energy. It's a little more abstract and metaphysical than some of their other ones. But the record is in some ways their rawest and most minimal. So Diocletian is obviously a big deal in the world of modern war metal, and might be the major reason the genre has had such a rise in prestige in the last 15 years. Like, I think a lot more people clearly care about war metal to the point where now, like, basically normies are discovering it and imitating it. I think Revenge, I think the resurgence of the popularity of Diocletian led to this sort of resurgence of interest in bands like Revenge. Mm-hmm. Diocletian is a band that I have liked for a long time, and that you have never really been able to get into.
Yeah, I think I missed the boat on them. I just didn't really listen to the first few albums when they were contemporary, and I've heard some songs over the years, but my opinion was always essentially, this seems like pretty good war metal, but it just didn't really have distinctive enough features for me to understand why they in particular were such a fixation for so many people.
Well, I think for a lot of people, including me, they were kind of a gateway into the whole style. So if you had already been listening, you liked shit like Lust back then. Right? Yeah,
I'd heard all the old war metal stuff.
You were pretty deep into the old war metal shit. But for somebody like me, they were a gate into that. I think it is fair to say, and I don't really think this is anything to knock the band, one reason Diocletian got so big is that they nailed an aesthetic.
Yeah.
And it's a very cool aesthetic, and it is one that is more appealing to people who might normally like things like black metal, which is certainly what drew me in. So, how would you characterize the concept of the band? Basically, Diocletian is the, I think one reason it got so big was that it was this grand unification of the two sides of war metal, right? The one that that everyone normally thinks of when they think about war metal, which is your bestial war metal, and the side of it that maybe wasn't always recognized as such, but that we've talked a lot about on the show, which you could call epic war metal, right? And overall, it sounded more like bestial war metal in the tradition of Blasphemy or any number of other bands, right? With a kind of sickening atonality, strangely shaped sliding riffs, grinding energy, and a root in sort of primitive grinding death metal. And a noisy raw production. But on the other hand, their aesthetic signaled a signaled this more sort of epic war metal thing, right? It's sort of instead of having imagery of like goats and goats and demons and turbo nun fucking and all that, right? They had sort of stern martial imagery, right? Their logo, that iconic image of the iron fist, and in that aesthetic, they're drawing on the epic war metal bands like Axis of Advance and Rites of Thy Degringolade from the Canadian scene, or the early bands on Invictus Productions. So Spearhead, Allfather, Scythian, all of whom I liked a lot before I heard Diocletian. And that's, although it was more obvious in the aesthetic, that's also an important part of Diocletian's sound. They had this, they sort of unified the, they on the one hand drew on this like really muddy, raw approach, but on the other hand, they had some of that clarity of outline that you would get in an Axis of Advance or a Spearhead or something. That sort of severity, an aesthetic we talked a lot about in the Spite Extreme Wing review, but this kind of like crisp, disciplined martial music that was sort of angular or jagged or architectural, which a lot of those epic war metal bands are drawing from Morbid Angel. And so Diocletian has it has the unhinged rawness and the crispness of form, the clarity of form. And that union means that the union of the more chaotic and disciplined sides of war metal means that at their best, there was always a room for a lot of musical spontaneity. Different parts bouncing off each other, genuinely crazed live playing, and full band interaction. And I think that was always a really important part of the band that I appreciated. And riff-wise, you would be dealing for the most part with these simple, gnarly atonal riffs. The nastier the intervals, the better. The best of those old Diocletian riffs on Doomcult or War All Against All are the ones that sounded like kind of typical Black or Death riffs, but twisted them in some ugly way. And then also a few shades, just here and there, of epic consonant melody. Right, and often just in like one interval in a riff that hinted at that more sort of noble, martial, heroic side of the band. But yeah, so that's the appeal of Diocletian. It's sort of like the ultimate. It was an attempt at the ultimate war metal band.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's interesting. So, like I said, I didn't have a lot of experience with Diocletian apart from hearing some songs here and there. So I decided to actually go back and do my homework and listen to the whole discography up to this point over the past couple days, which was kind of interesting. Diocletian strikes me as a band that I don't know. I'm kind of confused still, because some of it hews so closely to the established war metal formula, it gets into that sort of tribute territory of a lot of modern war metal bands, but periodically they'll have, and usually not just like a riff, but like entire songs that are very interesting and have ideas that are pretty out of step with the rest of war metal. But it seems very inconsistent to me. There seems to be a tendency for the band to have this solid, very traditional foundation of war metal, and then reach out on a handful of tracks per album toward more dynamic territory, and then sort of retreat back like a hermit crab. It's very strange. That being said, I am interested because the discography so much better than me. I actually found, and I guess this is a weird take, I thought that Amongst the Flames of a Burning God was probably my favorite.
Dude, that's a good pick. That makes sense for me.
Yeah, because it's like, and another thing, one thing I did want to bring up, because actually before hearing you talk about it, before seeing the notes, I had a question about Diocletian, which was... this band really needs to decide what it is. Is it like unhinged and animalistic, or is it like martial dominant authority? Mm-hmm. I find the contrast between those sides to like sometimes be a strength, but other times be a weakness, and sometimes the material can come off unfocused as a result. So I think that I like Amongst the Flames because it commits, at least to my ear, a little bit more fully to just, like, traditional bashing, wildly atonal, very grindy war metal. It's a very tight package. It's like under half an hour, and it just does, it gets in and gets out and does exactly what I want a war metal record to do.
But at the same time, I feel like that also has that Morbid Angel-derived crispness of execution in it. Although I get that emotionally it feels more like unhinged, bestial, chaotic.
Well, it's funny that you say that it has that Morbid Angel thing, and I'm sure that it does, because the death metal band that every war metal band listens to is Morbid Angel, isn't it?
Well, I feel like it... I guess that's probably true for all of them, but I feel like something like Blasphemy would have a lot in common also just with, like, Repulsion, or...
Sure.
Or a bunch of other sort of primitive death metal bands that you know better than me.
But let's take it another step. Is it actually Morbid Angel that all the war metal bands listen to, or is it just Angel Corpse?
That's a fair question, too. I think some of them it is actually... I think, like, some of those British bands I was talking about, like Spearhead, really do sound like Morbid Angel. But yeah, Angel Corpse is a very good example for the more sort of epic war metal side, even though their music isn't that melodic.
Yeah. And I guess this sort of brings me to a weird little referendum on war metal that I want to make. I don't know if these are hot takes or if this is even like an idea that people particularly care about, but it was turning in my head, listening to both of the albums on this episode, as well as just kind of going over popular war metal of the past 10 years. So there's the question. It's like, well, Morbid Angel, that's the death metal band that every war metal band listens to. But is it really Morbid Angel? Is it just Angel Corpse? And by way of Angel Corpse getting to Morbid Angel, what are the other death metal bands that war metal bands listen to? And... Oh,
Incantation. Has to be.
Incantation... occasionally, except none of war metal actually sounds like Incantation. So it's like, I'm sure that they listen to the aesthetic of Incantation, but they don't really listen to the riffs. War metal, here's the hot take. War metal is chaotic black death metal that is only listened to by black metal people.
I think that's true.
Death metal people don't fucking listen to war metal. And I think that is a part of the problem with war metal, actually, is that it's the incorporation of death metal into war metal is just... It's almost an inversion of the relationship between death metal and black metal in, like, early USBM. Of, death metal guys trying...
I see what you mean.
Yeah, death metal guys trying to imitate tropes of black metal, but really just reinserting them into a death metal context. War metal is the sound of black metal guys trying to emulate certain aspects of death metal, but really just folding it back into black metal itself. That's
a very good take.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's why there's something distinct in... That's why the more successful approaches to things like this are often those that really are sounding the bands that Hessian firms say that do the approaching black metal mood in a death metal way, right? Mm-hmm. Death metal guys playing towards black metal rather than black metal guys assimilating a vague idea of the things they think are coolest in death metal.
Yes.
Some of the bands that we like best from that epic war metal side, like Axis of Advance, or even if you want to go further out, like Argoslant or Ares Kingdom, right? Those guys all have kind of this death metal and thrash metal vocabulary in their bones.
They actually listen to death metal, yes.
Right, Axis of Advance and Rites of the Ida Gringolet really sound like death metal.
Yeah.
But it's funny that it happens on the less bestial side. On the more bestial, I think you're right that on the more bestial, even though the epic war metal bands, mood-wise, feel more like where pagan black metal has gone, the chaotic, grinding, bestial goat fuck bands sound more like black metal on a musical level and are more rooted in that perspective.
Mm-hmm. And so I think this is worth bringing up because Diocletian clearly do listen to death metal in a way that a lot of other war metal bands clearly don't. But like this framing, I think, is really important to understanding some of the limitations of war metal and why it's, at least in my view, kind of stagnated. You know, I don't think that really war metal as a genre has progressed too far past like the third Revenge record. And I think that's because like the death metal elements of the music have been relegated to just like it's heavy and the vocals are low sometimes. But it's also just because like aesthetically the audience for it is not really drawn to the things that make death metal death metal. I mean, you know, here's the rule with war metal. A war metal band is cool if you can listen to them and say, yeah, these guys probably legitimately do like Cannibal Corpse.
Yeah, well, death metal guy, I think that's a very good take. Yeah, so this leads us to an interesting question, which is the matter of Gesundrian, or probably Gesundrian. This is... So you asked about, like, where your take on the... where your sort of emphasis... Where your take on the discography stood relative to other people's, right?
I know that Gesundrian is, like, the one that everyone
That's the
about.
big one. And so on our Discord, at least, a lot of people don't like the new Diocletian record, and they don't like it because it doesn't sound like Gesundrian. A lot of people were also not that stoked on Amongst the Flames of a Burning God because it didn't sound like Gesundrian at all, right? You can see Metal Archives, there's more reviews for that one on MA than for Gesundrian, and it's at a 62%.
Which is, like, ridiculous. Because Gesundrian is just like, oh, what if we took war metal and made it boringer? And then I guess...
Right, so...
I guess that's what makes it epic, right? We do, like, the slow parts and, like, we fucking repeat a lot. You know?
Right, well, Gesundrian, the weird thing is, Gesundrian is their most death metal record. It has the most elongated tremolo leads. It has more sort of complex songs. It produces the kind of drama and riff experience that people seek in a death metal band, or maybe that black metal people seek when they think of death metal.
I think you nailed it there.
Yeah, there we go. That's what's wrong with Gesundrian. It is a record that it was the first death metal record for many black metal and hardcore people. And the weird thing about it is that the algorithm loved it. Right?
Yeah.
It's hard to think. Now that the algorithm is so bespoke or curated, it's hard to think of that happening anymore. But there was this brief historical window where a sort of militant elitist war metal band was being bumped to the front of everybody's YouTube queues, including just people who had some sort of casual interest in metal. And you know. That one had the sick Paolo Girardi cover of, Vlad Tepes on a Warhammer 40k battlefield. Like, it was very cool aesthetically. But from that record, I listened to it so many times, and I swear the only track I remember is Beast Atop the Trapezoid.
Yeah.
And it had a bunch more of the annoying slow parts, which were an unfortunate feature of their sound that you got more of on War of All Against All.
Yeah, I think War of All Against All was, like, the weakest of the discography for me. It just felt very nondescript. I don't know, that's just how I feel. Doom Cult, kind of cool. Has a couple tracks on the back end that I think are really interesting. Like, they do some kind of crusty stuff that's really interesting. But yeah, no, the last one from 2019, that's the one.
All right, sorry for that hiccup, guys. We heard the background noise dramatically intensify, as I'm sure you did. And, we had to break it off due to a sudden downpour and the howling of metal wolves in the background of my recording studio.
Which is still there, but it's cool and atmospheric.
Yeah, now it's cool and atmospheric. I did a little more to seal my recording tomb. But yeah, so yeah, you really like Amongst the Flames of a Burning God. I like that one a lot too. To me, I think Doom Cult is still where it's at. And I like War of All Against All too. Maybe that's just because that's where I got into them. I think it's an uneven record. I think most of it is essentially Doom Cult Part 2 in a good way. But there are some unfortunate things on it, like a few very boring, sort of trudging, momentumless slow songs that don't really work like slow death metal or doom or anything. Fortress of the Unconquerable is arguably an interesting track because they commit to it completely, but it's just 15 minutes where nothing much happens. So I think I really liked the first couple, and I really, really did not like Ysundrian, and I liked Amongst the Flames a lot. That also came out the same summer as the Concrete Winds record, so 2019 was pretty lit. But so Inexorable Nexus now, it's... What have they done here? Well... It is in many ways a return to the sound quality and songwriting approach of Doom Cult and War of All Against All. It's like they were on a path of development there, and they just, they broke it off with Ysundrian and Amongst the Flames, and then they just returned to it. They're like taking up the chain where it was broken. And I think this is hands down the most black metal Diocletian record. Which, by your terms, might make it the most honest. In a sense that this is really, okay, this is war metal as a kind of black metal. The riffs have the same kind of minimalist savagery as on those early records, but maybe even more so. There's always been a sort of Discharge-esque quality to how they arrange riffs, a hardcore quality. I think that's very strong on this record. Wait, did you know Caller of the Storm's guests on this?
Oh, he does?
Yeah, pretty cool. But the overall... So this is their most black metal sounding one, both in terms of its minimalism, rawness, and its mood. And that's a little more of an intangible thing. But let me show you the second track. It's called Heathen Siege. And when as we lead into it, I want to remind you that one reason Diocletian has always covered their records in these wolves and shit like that is Diocletian has always been a pagan metal band. So that is very cool to me. They lay down the basic form of that riff with power chords, but it is almost the strongest voice there is this overlay of like octave and fifth harmonies coming through. When I first heard it, not on headphones, it just sounded like harmonics. But what I hear them doing now is exploiting the noise harmonics their music has always produced. Diocletian has always generated really cool drone effects and like sort of phantom tones that you can hear coming in over the chords. And it feels like here they're doing it deliberately and even working in chording that does that more and brings it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're like stacking octave chords on top of each other.
Yes. And so they're like, there's a thing that was implicit in the production before and that they're now doing deliberately in a really cool way. And it works as noise on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's a very clear voice cutting over the top of it. And it sounds like a sort of resolute trumpet melody, right? It's one of those sort of classic budget epic melodies. Mm-hmm. A lot more consonant than they normally go for. And when I heard that, I thought, this is like Unchain the Wolves. I told you I was listening to Unchain the Wolves the other week, and I never realized how much like Graveland it was.
Yeah, it's definitely a weird record.
Yeah. Yes, and Diocletian, of course, they're New Zealand, not Australia, but they're closely connected to the Aussie war metal scene, right? And of course, I'm sure they're very influenced by Bestial Warlust, which then turns into D666. Mm-hmm. And a big part of D666 is this kind of death metal guy plays pagan black metal effect. It was these extremely lumbering, misshapen, kind of atonal takes on heroic riffing. Often with like the thing Rob Darkin would do in sort of sophisticated folk chording, just being played as this like single resonant lead. And Diocletian, of course, played much faster than that. And with a bunch of other different ideas, but I hear a strong overtone of this Australian Graveland sound on this record, or Australia and Oceanian, Antipodian Graveland sound, and as soon as I thought that, right, when I was listening to that blasting riff, I was like, oh wait, this is like D66. Then suddenly we just get Dropout. Swords and axes sample, right? Diocletian has, for the most part, been very focused on modern warfare, right? You know, your gun sounds and nukes and shit like that. Suddenly we just get swords. And in the slow parts, this song has a lot. This is a 3-part suite called Heathen Siege. There are definitely discrete parts to this long track, but they're sort of threaded together with the sword sounds and various things. But the slow stuff on here also feels a lot like just raw pagan black metal. And towards the back half of it, they start to bring in these long, unfolding folk leads, kind of like an epic doom band or something. Or simply like Axis of Advance on Strike.
Yeah, but obviously much more minimal distilled than Axis.
Yes, for sure. And so you get this feeling that that sort of heathen wolf worship part of this, the implied Odinism of Diocletian, is just on full volume on this record. And I love it because it is both more sort of it has more of that archaic pagan spirit and the epic war metal vibe, while at the same time sounding more noisy and unhinged. This really relates to like Following the Voice of Blood and Carpathian Wolves, especially the bludgeoning shit on Carpathian Wolves. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can definitely see the connection there. I mean, Diocletian, at least through their discography, seems to have a more immediate connection to proper old school metal than a lot of war metal bands, which tend to sound like they're mostly listening to each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Diocletian actually listens to those old records. They don't just have them to post on reels on Instagram or something.
Yeah, for sure. There's a deeper sense of metal history here. And then, so do we want to go to... My next sample is pretty straightforward. Or do you have anything to say about that one? What's your read?
Well, no, I'll kind of get to, you know, so on this record, I've got kind of a different take on it because, like, I guess you could say this is their most black metal record, but I'd say the death metal content that's on here is, like, the purest and the most, like, definitively death metal that I've heard from this band. And actually, you know, my favorite stuff is clustered toward the back half of this record. There's like cool moments on the first half, but they're like your kinds of moments, like big drone moments and shit. I like the fucking like kind of techie trem riffs that start popping up at the end. Yeah.
Well, dude, I mean, yes. So maybe this is the greatest Diocletian record because of something for everyone. But, like, more than that, I love the back end, too. When I listen, I don't think I've ever had such an easy time picking out favorite parts for a record. Like, I just knew, okay, I have to sample this and that. But also, there kept being so many favorite parts towards the back half of the record. And on war metal albums especially, that's not always common.
Definitely not. It's almost against type for the genre.
Yeah. So before we go to the more sort of technically intense and riffy tracks on the back end that the death metal guy likes, we'll do one more sample from me. This is right around the mid-range of the record. This is Barbaric Hunt, parentheses, Feral Play. Feral Play would be something very different.
Ooh. I've seen that video. That was from Denmark in the 80s before laws happened.
All right. So Barbaric Hunt, Feral Prey. And this is just pretty much a classic first two records Diocletian riffing, but I think a lot tighter. A lot like more... just very, very tight riff sequencing. So there's a Morbid Angel riff.
Yeah, that's a proper Morbid Angel riff. It's not an Angel Corpse riff, because an Angel Corpse riff is a Morbid Angel riff with all the interesting stuff taken out. I don't know. I'm mean about Angel Corpse for some reason.
I get it. I like Angel Corpse, but it's a very... If you're a huge Morbid Angel fan, it's a very sort of reductive take on your favorite band.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. It's regressive Morbid Angel. It's like, yo, you know what was cool? Altars of Madness. You know what's even cooler? Like, if you did Altars of Madness and it sounded more like Bathory.
Yeah.
Right? So I totally get that. I don't listen to Angel Corpse much, and honestly, maybe for that reason. But that is a real Morbid Angel riff in that it sounds like uncanny architecture moving at impossible speeds. and it has that sort of stacked shape. Really cool. Maybe one of the first big real death metal riffs on the record, opening into the second side. But before that, it's just a really cool sequence. So that first riff, the kind of half-step hammer-on thing, right? That, again, also has some of that budget epic Graveland feeling, but it also really recalls... It really echoes a couple tracks in their early discography, namely Bullet Vomited and Nuclear Vomited, both of which feel more like speed metal than this, but it kind of recalls that riff. And then the second riff is another big riff here. That's a good example of one of these blasphemy-style, grotesque atonal riffs. It has a very odd shape. I couldn't describe it. It just sort of slides down. It sort of tremolos down a scale in a really gnarly way, and then slides back up it, hitting bizarre notes. And the timing to it is unusual, which is an important aspect of Diocletian and war metal riffing in general, which often goes by the wayside.
Well, I think what you're hearing there is Diocletian appreciating a part of early war metal that has been like sort of forgotten, which is like its proximity to proper grindcore.
Yes,
I think
that makes sense.
Yeah, I think Diocletian still appreciates that like Blasphemy and Conqueror can be thought of as grindcore bands in a certain sense, and that was really important to early war metal. And Bestial Warlust, absolutely, that like basically is a grindcore band. Now, like, people still, like, kind of think of it as grindy, but what they mostly mean is just, like, a lot of blast beats and a lot of distortion. Like, early war metal really does sound, like, structurally, riff to riff, like a lot of early grindcore. There's a lot of, like, napalm death in, you know, Blasphemy and Conqueror.
Yeah, and you can still hear that here. I think that's a very good point. And yeah, in a way, part of that early grindcore sound was a feeling of randomness, usually in much simpler riffs. So this is an example of a longer, extended tremolo riff in a death or black metal style that still feels rhythmically and intervallically random, which is cool. So yes, we always talk about, is it grindcore? Well, does it grind? This record grinds extremely hard when it's going fast. And there's also some sick pick slides there. War metal's you have to have pick slides. And another important thing there is they're shifting between different speeds of blast beat. You get maybe not literal speeds, but there are like 3 or 4 different kinds of blast being played there, ranging from full-on 16th blast to their sort of patented war metal half blast, and this kind of like syncopated alternate, you know, syncopated alternation of the snare with the cymbal, the more pulsed blasting. Yeah, so there's a lot of... What?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, what they're kind of playing with there is, like, technique that is explored by what's probably my favorite war metal band, as loose as that term is anymore, which is Archgoad. It's a very Archgoad kind of technique they're using, I think.
Yeah, you're right. Archgoad are masters of the half blast. Yeah, and Diocletian has a lot of that stuff, but they do it really well here. They're not playing as fast as they did on Flames of a Burning God, but boy, does it feel fast. Diocletian have covered D-Beat songs. They will never play D-Beat in one of their tracks, although, God, I'd love to hear it.
Isn't there one on... Because there was one song that was really notable to me on Doom Cult. It was... I think it was Bullet Vomited. Doesn't that have a D-Beat on it?
Maybe, or maybe it has a thrash beat or something. Yeah,
because I remember that one as being like the really crusty one that really caught my ear.
Yes, I loved that and Nuclear Vomited. I think those were my favorites back in the day, for sure. So, okay, maybe they have played a DB, but the point is there's a sense of momentum in the music. And, you know, with riffs like this, they capture... One thing Diocletian really pinpoints is the grotesque aspect of the heroic, right? So they reach from that sort of chaotic bestial war metal towards this more this more heroic epic war metal sound, but they capture the grotesquerie of it, the way that the hero partakes of the essence of the monster, right? Odin will die to the wolf, but he also becomes the wolf and is a friend of the wolf. In Egil's saga from Iceland, Egil is famously ugly. He's bad-tempered and ugly, and he turns into a wolf, and his dad turned into a wolf before him. There's Kohellan, who just spouts blood from his head, and his jaw unhinges, and his eye pops out, right? So Diocletian has this kind of the monstrous aspect of the hero, or the warrior in general, is an important aspect of the sound, and on gnarly grindcore riffs like that, you can really hear it.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, back half of the record, which is what really grabs my attention. Subjugation Before Annihilation. This is probably my favorite song. This has, I think, my favorite sort of single note death metal trem riffs on it, which I think is something that other war metal bands like badly need to use more of, because Diocletian's actually really good at it, and it sounds distinctly death metal, but it also kind of sounds like an alternate universe where Marduk is like a pure death metal band. It's a really interesting effect, and it's one of the only things that I've heard that sounds like fully elevated and separate from both death and black metal. Is a unique reinterpretation of a certain kind of riffing. You can see its origins in the two parent genres, but there's stuff on this track that I can point to and say, this is war metal. This makes an argument for war metal as a genre proper. So, fuck yeah. That main riff is both of our favorite riff on the album. So it's just they go through multiple interpolations of it. They know it's super strong, so they provide different variations, all with different subtle fluctuations on mood. And this is where I'll get back to something about the whole like war metal death metal connection. So we've established that most war metal is mostly like black metal guys playing with death metal ideas. Why is it that we don't hear more riffs like this in war metal?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I have an answer. It's because it's mostly coming from black metal guys who can't fucking play guitar well enough. No, I'm dead serious. I'm dead serious. Because it's something that I've learned as I've been in more and more bands over the years, and I've talked to more and more people, is that the black metal scene's insistence in more stripped down and primitive guitar work is not always an aesthetic choice. And certain compromises are made when playing with some of these ideas. I think, and especially after having seen a lot of... I was looking at some live video of some popular war metal bands just casually today on YouTube. Just sort of came up in the algorithm. And I'm not going to name names, but we will say that the playing is not as sophisticated as the rough and chaotic production might imply. I think that Diocletian can pull off riffs like this because they actually listen to death metal, and I'm pretty, like, the guys in this band have, like, played in actual death metal bands, right?
I don't know, let's see.
Oh, yeah, the bassist, he was in Dawn of Azazel, other guys have been in various things. Yeah, so that, like, immediately, that's something that needs to be understood. I mean, I think we all get it, but I think it needs to be stated again. The technical demands of the average death metal band are just much higher than that of the average black metal band. Which is not to say that that's a better or worse thing, but it does mean that when black metal guys start playing around with death metal ideas and they're not able to rise to the technical demands, like, necessary to play death metal things, what you end up getting is a sort of retarded version of them. But Diocletian...
And not in a good way.
Yeah, but Diocletian can actually play the fucking thing, so it sounds good. You know? This is just really striking. This is awesome, and I think that Diocletian should do more stuff like this. If there's a point on this record that I find to be a weakness, and this is a personal thing, it is the... I don't know if it's a devotion because of what they think the band is supposed to be, or just an earnest love for it. But there's, there's some holding pattern war metal stuff on this that I'm just not that interested in. I think that I'm starting to realize I don't really like war metal that much. I just like a few war metal bands a whole lot. But yeah. When Diocletian steps outside of that, when they start playing more technically and with some of these more exciting melodic ideas, I think something really special happens. And, if they did a whole album of tracks like this, I think that would immediately go to, a candidate for Album of the Year for me. It's just really awesome.
I think part of what you're getting at is the technical thing is, as you say, death metal players often have much stronger right-hand work. Mm-hmm. Right? And black metal often, its problem is that there are these long, undifferentiated tremolo riffs that just sort of flow without a lot of clear markers in them and turning points and inflection. And there's crisp, rhythmic right-hand work in Diocletian. And that's why they can play this sort of very complex thrash riff that moves all over the fretboard. Mm. I gotta say, this track in particular, though, I mean, it reminds me of, I guess, a kind of war metal, but again, that's more on the epic war metal side, which is Aussie black thrash. Mm, it sounds like Gospel of the Horns, but Gospel of the Horns are deliberately extremely primitive. Mm-hmm. Whereas this is a sophisticated death metalized version of it that also has a kind of the totally fucked tonality you would get in death metal.
Yeah, you would be able to speak to that better than me just because I don't know that scene very well. But yeah, I mean, even bringing it to something closer that is a little bit more familiar, I can imagine certain configurations like this being a very stripped down version of things you would hear in Mongrel's Cross.
Yes, Mongrel's Cross is another example. I mean, the Armored Angel has insane right-hand work, right? It's kind of part of that tradition. Yeah. So it really speaks to that.
Black metal guy. There's a siren. Is that warning us of a violent, eradicating hammer strike?
Sick. Let's go. dude.
Yeah, that song is awesome. What I really like here is, like, this is, like, full bloom for me. This is where, like, the idea of Diocletian comes together. Because they understand that the sort of, like, okay, there is a utility to some of these stock war metal gestures and riffs. The opening riff, we've heard that, like, a billion times before. That's a standard, just sort of war metal drone riff. But they augment it by getting to the second riff that is this sort of like shepherd's tone climbing variation to build tension. Diocletian, especially on this song, understands that those war metal gestures are best used as sort of like grindcore tension builder riffs. Mm-hmm. Kind of in the same way that you would hear those like fast looping dissonant power chord trem riffs on like an early Cryptopsy record over the fastest blast beats. Those are just there as like interstitial material to build tension and build momentum before we get to the next like proper part of the song. And you can hear it works really well. It works as a great intro section before they dive into that really sick fucking riff. Again, all it is jumping up a string in the thrash metal motif. It's like almost a Slayer riff, but it works really fucking well.
I think they're really good when they thrash.
Yeah, I think they are. Maybe that's it. Diocletian are a good war metal band because they haven't forgotten how to be a metal band.
All right, and we are back from talking about how I need to call my mother to review another work of withering Antipodean war metal. This is Heresiarch's Edifice, out on Iron Bonehead. So, Heresiarch. This band disappeared for a long time. Heresiarch were essentially they're kind of like also a New Zealand band and kind of the little brother band to Diocletian. While there are no Diocletian members still in Heresiarch, their old lineup included three of them. And there was other crossover through other projects as well, like Witch Christ. So they were kind of in the shadow of Diocletian from the get-go, but also got a lot of attention from that. I remember Whalewolf 2014 being kind of cool, sounded kind of promising, had that sort of more sort of like the new Diocletian, kind of a more explicit, archaic pagan framework for it, which sounded promising. But then they put out Death Ordinance in 2017, and it really wasn't that good. There were a lot of... On Death Ordinance and on the previous stuff, it really just sounded kind of like this, by then, trademarked New Zealand war metal style. It had a very cool production, it had a cool Paolo Girardi cover, but... aside from the sound quality, it just was not that interesting. I remember some of the slower parts being more compelling than some of Diocletian's slow parts, but that's about all I could tell you. Then they just went away for fucking 7 years, right? Death Ordinance was 2017. They're finally back, and I gotta say, this has to be one of the most dramatic cases of... taking it back to the woodshed in metal history. By that, I mean, it's this jazz trope of basically like shedding, right? You go lock yourself in the shed and you practice. Or like Miles Davis quit heroin by locking himself in the shed, essentially. And I think that's what Heresiarch were doing, because they sound like a different band in a lot of ways. You can still hear the war metal roots here, but there's really a question as to whether this even is war metal, or sort of kind of more arty black death metal.
Ortho Cavern.
Oh, you're right. It doesn't sound that much like Incantation, but it is sort of war metal-y, death metal-y stuff that sounds like orthodox black metal.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right. At times it reminds me of some of the more death metal-y moments on Aosoth, or like Aosoth if they played fast throughout, for the most part. Well, there's a lot of slow parts in this record. They're just not very interesting, which we'll get to. But it does sound adjacent to stuff like Aosoth and the other sort of grander French Orthodox black metal bands. There's a lot more melodic texture, or a lot more melody and harmonic texture, sort of multiple guitar layers, an interesting production that keeps a lot of low-end attack while providing crisp high-end, and riffs that are strangely shaped in a way that maybe follows on the Diocletian and Blasphemy lineage, but much more complex and less sort of grotesque or chaotic. These are kind of elaborate Baroque riffs that show the sign of a lot of songwriting. So I could actually get to a sample if you want to go in real fast, or we can give our overall takes on it.
I don't know. We talked a fair amount between sections. Okay, let me put it out there. Okay, so Edifice is a record that is capitalizing on a thing that I think is happening in extreme metal that we've talked about to some degree before, which is the sort of a black metalification of everything. Not just necessarily in musical terms, but in sort of like aesthetics a prevailing interest in atmosphere with a capital A. This is... I feel like a lot of records are being made now in various genres that exist primarily to be listened to by black metal fans, primarily. We touched on this in the Diocletian review, the idea that war metal is essentially only listened to by black metal fans. And frankly, I think Edifice is this is in some ways probably more death metal than the Diocletian record, but even fewer death metal people are going to listen to this. This is exclusively for a sort of arty black metal person or Black Death person, but Black Death really just means black metal these days. And another thing that should be mentioned, the specter of ulcerate looms heavy over this record, right, as it probably does over a large swath of the New Zealand scene. And in some sense, we can't blame them for that. When you're from a relatively small regional scene, the explosive success that a band like Ulcerate experienced would undoubtedly have a ton of influence on the bands around it. But the result of this is something that is not really able to find a place for itself, in that it aspires to the sort of arty, labyrinthine quality of Ulcerate, while wanting to provide something more stripped down and direct, and I guess in some sense aggressive, more in keeping with the New Zealand war metal scene proper. But these tendencies, at least to me, work at cross purposes with each other, and the record ends up just being kind of a shrug at the end.
Yeah, I think I like it better than you, but I agree that this record has some problems. I think that the most optimistic reading of this would be they really, if you had heard the older stuff, I think you would appreciate this more as a sort of night and day development, right? Okay. They made a serious effort to develop a unique personality as a band, right? And based on the gambit I think you've just described, right? Can we unify Diocletian and Ulcerate? It's a pretty good way of describing it. And that's not like, it's not at face value, that's like an potentially interesting concept, but it does run into the problems you just described of ending up neither here nor there. I think what I hear is a band that has moved a lot of away towards a new sound, but might need to keep moving. Like, as much as it would be cool if this were just like the glorious explosion from the chrysalis, it might be that another record would nail it. Maybe that's a cop-out answer on my part, but I think there are parts of this record that are very cool, and I think that I think certain tracks sound more successful than others.
That's fair. Yeah.
So I think one big problem that we'll hear throughout the record is something you put your finger on in the notes, which is that the songs have a really hard time getting started. And that extends to a lot of... That particular problem shows up in a lot of different ways. There's sort of stop-start songwriting throughout this in a way that kind of interferes with the better ideas. And that's both in terms of how songs are structured and just like within riffs and drum parts. That's one problem. But parts of this record sort of overcome that hesitation in a pretty cool way. So I think it just depends on where they're sticking the landing and where not so much. To give an idea of the transformation in sound this band has undergone, I thought we would just... This isn't the most remarkable track on the record, or like my favorite part, but it stood out to me instantly. It's an intro. This is the first track, Forged Doctrine, and there's a very cool main riff where you can hear, okay, we're not really in war metal country anymore. So we're going to start out in the middle of one of the sort of out section in the middle where there's a pretty cool power chord riff under a solo, and then at the end of the sample, you'll hear the main trem riff, which repeats a couple times. It's a very long riff. So I really like that last riff.
It's pretty neat.
It is very difficult to hum, but it actually can get stuck in your head. It has a lot of weird... the basic riff has a lot of weird turns in it. And in that riff, you can hear the characteristic things about this record. You have an undertone of sort of grinding bass and power chord, and then this kind of squalling lead over it, which is very clear, and where it seems like he's shifting between isolated trem lead and like chording. There's... the riff bears the sign of work. You can almost hear, like, it's not a war metal riff, but maybe it used to be one. Mm-hmm. Like, he took something that was more like a Diocletian riff and, like, doubled the length and stretched everything out and started, like, adding weird bends and staggers in it. So that you end up with something that is, more ornate. And so you can hear... like, I think in that riff, you can literally hear the work that has gone into this record and into trying to set the band apart. And it sounds, in that riff, you can hear, it doesn't sound like it's not cut from whole cloth. Like, you can really hear that there was some initial riff and then a lot of things have been done to it to try to make it weird.
Yeah.
However, I think the end result works. I think it's a distinctive, interesting riff, and it kind of sets a tone for other riffs on the record that are like that, but sound a bit more seamless.
Yeah, I mean, that raises an interesting idea about the writing of this. How much of this might originate from around the era of the first album or the early EPs, and then the pivot in style necessitated that those ideas be reworked a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good point. That very well could be the case.
So, let me go to one now. I appreciate that using that sample, because the first track on this record I would call what we say in the political world is red meat for the base, or for the constituency. That's where they that's where they get you. That's where they get you for being a metalhead. But no, they're baiting you in right here, because the center of gravity on this record, I would argue, is not stuff like that. So let's go to gloryless execution. So here's my short take. Heresiarch is a band of guys who like ulcerate, but they want to do tougher stuff, but their hearts aren't really in that anymore. They like the melodic touches of ulcerate, but they want to do something more straightforward and impactful, but then they want to maintain the labyrinthine song structures, and the result of that is like a lot of riffs that kind of don't go anywhere on their own, and they're pivoting and changing so rapidly, they're not really able to develop any energy. And as a result, you'll get songs that are very fast and very cluttered with ideas, but sort of have no momentum. And here's my case in point for that.
It's a void.
The wrong answer at the gender reveal party. It's a void. Yeah. Yeah, there's these fucking voids all over the album, which is a imitative of a lot of things, but in this case, it's like specifically imitative of ulcerate, except when ulcerate does it, it's not actually a void. It's got a ton of like really complex timbral stuff going on. The time signatures that they're using are really fucking weird. And they also have, like, one of the best drummers in the world to fill the space with all sorts of interesting rhythmic textures as well. When Heresiarch does it, it just sits. And the problem is, like, with so many bands in this sort of, like, genre or atmospheric niche, a completely undue amount of significance is given to these moments, where everything drops out, the momentum stops, and then we get either big minimal doom part or just like buzzing orthodox chord with Marshall snare rolls under it.
Or like practice arpeggio.
Yeah, and it's like
dissonant arpeggio, generic dissonant arpeggio.
And what I find interesting, okay, maybe this is catty, but I'm just like, it's funny how all of these like really smart bands have all arrived at the same fucking idea.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of a weird way of making. It's become somehow a shorthand for making the music sound significant. Right?
Yeah, it's like it's a shibboleth of giant lurking Lovecraftian monstrosity in the sky, probably drawn by that same guy that draws all the goddamn album covers that look like that. You know, it's so like more to the point. The problem is these voids dot this entire record. They are given a lot of time and a lot of structural significance, and all they do is crush whatever momentum was built before it.
It really compares well to Diocletian, right? Whereas Diocletian at times has spent a lot of time on sort of dreary, trudging, down-tempo riffs like this that don't have any momentum to them. Diocletian sort of got rid of that on the new album, right? There's the slower stuff has a lot more momentum to it on the new one. Whereas Heresiarch seemed to have like doubled down on it and added fancy leads.
Yeah, and they're like easily the worst feature of the record, but they are centered so intensely in these songs, like you can't just listen past them.
And as you said, the leads aren't actually that fancy. Or,
no,
as I said too.
No,
they sound fancy.
Yeah, I mean, these guys are capable musicians, and there is some kind of interesting stuff that will happen occasionally, at least in the rhythmic dimension. But for the most part, this is operating at like a pretty consistent 4/4 or 6/8, and they're just changing riffs very rapidly. Like there's less going on than meets the eye. Let me get to another one just to like make my point clearer and to pivot slightly. So we'll go to A World Lit Only by Fire, and I had to look it up, and yes, this is the name of Godflesh's 2014 comeback record. And I don't think that's coincidental. I don't think they just got it from the same place. I think it's directly referential because new Godflesh would be a thing that people who are into this would be into.
Hey, new Godflesh is good.
Is it?
Yeah, although it's honestly weird that these guys would like it because it sounds more like nu metal. Or beatdown.
Oh, yeah. But, you know, Broderick has the cultural credibility for that to be okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know. So anyway. So we're just going to go to the start of this. And we're going to have a really laborious opening. And then we're going to have some riffs. And some of them are good riffs and some are bad riffs. But what's important, I think, is the distinction of which ones are good and which ones are bad and why, and I think it'll be pretty clear upon a listen. So the way it lines up for me pretty distinctly is like pretty much 1-to-1. Death metal riffs bad, black metal riffs good. The death metal riffs aren't exceptionally bad. The black metal riffs aren't exceptionally good, but that's basically how it breaks down. I think this is a very firm case of a band whose creative hearts are really more in black metal. The first time I heard this record, a phrase just popped into my head, like 2 songs in, which is, the death metal here sounds like an aftermarket product. Like, it doesn't sound natural. It sounds very deliberately incorporated in a way that sounds like a conscious positioning of the band. The more aggressive and more sort of brutal deathy it sounds, the more artificial it sounds to me. It doesn't sound like a natural outgrowth of a creative process. It seems like they are trying to fulfill something.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're right. The death metal here and on a lot of the album really does sound like a brutal death metal, which I guess can be an undertone of ulcerate in a way. But you're right. This is that kind of, sort of 16th... This is riffs composed entirely of brutal death style chugs, or almost entirely. That sort of percussive chug. And they do that kind of staggered behind the beat chug thing is really important in this passage. That the first riff that comes in with that, it's not staggered in this way, and it has a thrashing structure, kind of a little bit like some of the best Diocletian riffs on the last record. And I like it, but after that, it starts to get more sort of convoluted, and they start to use this as an interruption. And I hear what you mean about aftermarket product. It's almost like they wrote some of the black metal riffs and then decided, okay, we've got a big idea here, right? Our big idea is that there's going to be this sort of mournful, heroic melody that's trying to break through from the morass of brutality, and it never gets there, right? Or it is, at least not in this part of the song. It keeps getting cut off by this just super brutal chug. And that is a very big idea, but it just doesn't, it doesn't sound good.
Oh, no, it just, while you were saying it just popped in my head. It's like, you're saying, we've got this great idea for a song, it's going to have this mournful, heroic melody trying to break through this morass of, dissonant atonal chaos. Oh, good job, guys. You found out black metal.
Yeah, true.
You found out the idea of black metal.
Yes, but the difference is that black metal lets it happen. And in this song, there's this kind of abstruse cerebral thing where they keep interrupting it because they have to prove the point. And so they introduce this little flash of something that sounds like a Swedish band or even like Senor Voland or something. Mm-hmm. And then they just cut it off. And then they do it again. And then they cut it off again. And then suddenly the interrupter riffs start interrupting the interrupter riffs. And what you're left with is just a pure morass of negation, that's not music.
Which is something you sort of pointed out about the song titles and the thematics of this.
Yeah, let's compare the song titles to the first one. First, Heresiarch record. Consecrating Fire, Storming Upon Knaves, Harbinger, Ruination, The Yoke, Iron Harvest, Lupine Epoch, Righteous Subsurgence, Desert of Ash. Let's compare the song titles on this one. Forged Doctrine, Manifest Odium, Noose Above the Abyss, Gloryless Execution. Do you see how they have a lot of terms that are negating each other? Mm-hmm. It's kind of a little bit like what was going on with that Flaming Ouroboros record. Yeah. Gloryless Execution, Tides of Regression. Is that a good or bad thing? A World Lit Only by Fire. Godflesh reference. Swarming Blight. Mystic and, I think it's Mysticism and Chaos. It can't be Mystic and Chaos. It is Mystic and Chaos. Okay, that's actually kind of a cool song title because it does make sense. That's that's some Brazilian shit. I like that. Hubris and Decline. Militate Pyrrhic Collapse. So just this kind of fixation on decline, collapse, etc. This is a very whereas the first one is just aggressive, this is very introspective and angst-ridden in terms of the lyrics. And I mean, I think serious thought has been put into the lyrics, and of course you can meaningfully talk about, collapse and decline and whatnot in metal, right? There are a lot of vocabularies for doing that. But what you can hear is there are war metal ideas here that are there's like war metal interfering with itself, is what the song titles suggest. And you can hear that self-interference in the music. I mean, maybe even more clearly.
Yeah, that's nothing to add. That's a very good take.
Well, thanks, bro. Okay, so on that note, here's a track so an interesting thing that does happen in A World Lit Only by Fire. In fairness to the band, there is a outburst of really glorious and kind of complex melody that has this sort of black metal thing, but still has this sort of churning undertone of death metal that happens in the back half of this song. Okay? And we do have to acknowledge that. It's a long song by war metal standards, right? More than almost 7 minutes. There is a moment where this melody does break through, or something like it breaks through, and it's really cool. But they don't really capitalize on that. In fact, they go back to a void, right? Which is, again, I understand the big idea. It breaks through, but then it's the oh no, it's the void. But like that just doesn't sound good. So there are moments like that there throughout the record. I really like some of the shorter tracks. Swarming Blight is awesome and has this kind of grindy, and instead of sounding like it's interrupting itself, it just grinds. Mm-hmm. And it has some of the more sort of epic black metal chord coloring to it. I think Swarming Blight is cool. I believe Hubris and Decline works like that too. But then we get to the last track, which is Militate Pyrrhic Collapse. And this one is so much better than most of the rest of the record that it almost feels like it's so different that I'm not sure how much it changes the overall evaluation of the record. But it also suggests that, okay, maybe this band is actually reaching towards something that will be really good. This is much more like a down-the-line epic war metal track, and it reminds me in ways of things like Into Oblivion and Axis of Advance. It's a lot more conspicuously melodic or consonant, but it still has a lot of the interesting rhythm work that you get on the rest of the record. So let's listen to the middle of this track, or no, sorry, just a little bit into it. This is also a long one. that's just sick all the way through.
Yeah, that's clearly better than everything else.
By a long shot.
Yeah.
So there you have some of the interruption effect at the end, but it's just hard as fuck. You get 4 riffs. You get this huge outburst of melody, which really sounds like Niden or Dawn, right? One of these sort of high, severe Black Death bands. It's also structured in a cool way. You get it's sort of AABB. You get riff 1, riff 1, riff 2, riff 2. There's a variation within it in an unusual way. And then it sort of plummets down into this grinding war metal part where we fade it out. That's awesome. But what's important is the setup. When we start the sample, we're in da 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 da. We're in sort of like the broken drum roll territory, but it's not breaking the momentum of the riff, and it's not linked to just meaningless interrupter riffs. It's there's this kind of thrashy Aeolian scale melody that's starting to take shape over it, is pretty neat. All right, there's leads flashing out over it and back into it. And then we end up in some much more jagged territory, but it's also cool. And you start to get these sort of like droning half blasts, and you realize that in the background there's like this atonal but really epic trem riff building behind it, which you didn't hear at first. And then suddenly we're back into the drum roll, and da 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 da. And then we've got this just big, thrashy, glorious kind of heavy metal riff smashes in over it with just, open power chords. And then we're in the epic trem part, right? And it's just really well sequenced. And it's because instead of trying to be smart, they're trying to be aggressive, powerful, and cool, and succeeding.